Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. A man who has devoted his life to this work is our first guest, a regular here, I'm pleased to say, I'm honored to say, at Securing America. His name is Captain James Fanell, United States Navy retired. He served with great distinction in the Naval Intelligence Branch for decades, rising to the rank, as I mentioned, of captain, but also he had the important responsibilities of being the chief of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet out in Hawaii. He is one of our go to guys on the Chinese Communist Party threat, what it represents at the moment, where it's headed, and what we best be doing about it. Captain Fennell, good to have you in house, sir, virtually. Welcome.
Frank, it's great to be with you again.
Let me ask you, for starters, Jim, as a longtime uh, man in the uniform of the United States Navy, now a veteran, what you make of the prospect that the people running the so called thrift savings plan, in which I imagine you have probably, like most in uniform and other government employees, civilians as well, of course, have invested considerable sums. They have in mind putting some of your money into companies that are owned or controlled by the Chinese Communist Party and perhaps even the People's Liberation Army itself. The particulars of how this is going to be done is something we can develop, but just the general proposition, how does that make you feel that, well, in prospect is your pension funds will be helping buy the weapons which will be used to kill people like you and perhaps the rest of us for that matter?
Yeah, Frank, it's really hard to imagine that we're going back through this again after the efforts that you and others helped lead to, stop during the Trump administration the TSP authority from taking our pension funds, our essentially our 401k, if you will, and investing that into China, which we know goes to fund munitions for the PLA. So, for instance, just in the last 24 hours, we've seen images now of the latest Chinese anti ship ballistic missile, the YJ-21 Eagle Strike, that's been imaged on the center line of an H-6 bomber that's been put out through the Chinese internet. And so now that bomber can fly from China out across the Pacific, not just one of them, but there'll be scores of them flying across the Pacific, 3,500 miles to launch a 1 or 2,000 mile anti-ship ballistic missile intended to sink our aircraft carriers that are going to be coming from the West Coast that would help defend Taiwan. This is in addition to the ballistic missiles and submarines and surface ships and aircraft that they already have designated to sink the US 7 fleet that's permanently residing out in the Western Pacific. So every time I read one of these stories that the TSP, my own government, is going to take my pension fund and give it to the Chinese Communist Party to invest in their companies, which some of those not some of them, all of those companies will some part of their profits go to the PLA. I just cannot comprehend it. We're paying to kill ourselves, and the people that are pushing this, Larry Fink and the BlackRock, they're they should be held accountable for this. And these are the same guys. These are the same guys that said, well, these are the same men that complained about Elon Musk buying Twitter and not caring a whit about fiduciary responsibilities. Yet, when we bring up this issue about giving our taxpayer funded money to the Chinese Communist Party to invest in the PLA, oh, we're told it's their fiduciary responsibility. These people are hypocrites.
Well, in the case of Larry Fink of BlackRock, what he is doing, both as a manager of the thrift savings plan, I think 80% of it is actually under the control of BlackRock. and in his role elsewhere with BlackRock, as you know, is promoting the so-called environment, social justice, and governance agenda, which the last time I checked, you know a lot more about the Chinese Communist Party than I do, Jim, but the last time I checked, they weren't so big on the environment or on anything remotely approaching social justice or governance, for that matter. I mean, they're the most rapacious country on the planet when it comes to despoiling the environment, for example. So the hypocrisy is rife, as you say, but it takes it to a whole nother level when it amounts to, it seems to me, as friends of ours at the Coalition for a Prosperous America have called it, economic treason. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. I can understand your fury, and I imagine that that will be shared by an awful lot of other folks who either wore uniforms or are wearing them today of our United States military, and have reason to think this is completely unacceptable. And I hope that that will help, despite the efforts to walk back President Trump's efforts of 2 years ago, to ensure that this kind of activity is not done through this thrift savings plan, or TSP, as you've called it. Let me pivot slightly, Jim, to another aspect of this. Larry Fink is an example of a phenomenon that I think you've coined a very important term for as well, and that is it's a kind of uh, grooming of people in support of the Chinese Communist Party. Talk a little bit about that, the role that elites that have been captured by the CCP are playing.
Yeah, Frank, the term groomer, as you mentioned, is, been out in the public arena here in the last week or two. And my use of that term as applied to what I call the China hands is purposeful because I think it elicits an emotional reaction. And I view the China hands community, these elites in Washington and the think tanks and in our government and in the other areas that follow China so closely. For instance, this last week up at Harvard, they had the 25th anniversary or reunion of China hands, essentially. And some of the senior folks there, like Chaz Freeman and Graham Allison and Steve Orleans and
Henry Kissinger
Larry
would
Summers.
fit the profile. Yeah.
Right. And they all came out, and Freeman was the one that said, it's the most important thing we can do is to train the new generation, to accept our view of engagement with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. So, in effect, they were admitting we are here to groom young minds and new academics in the university system to view China and the Chinese Communist Party the way we do. And I think that's something that we that are more committed to defense of the United States have kind of neglected. And so we need to think about what the next generation's being taught, how they're being taught about, hey, communism isn't that bad. The Chinese Communist Party actually is egalitarian and it helps people, and it's done a miracle job of raising so many people out of poverty. But they don't mention the million people in prison in Xinjiang. They don't mention the hostile takeover of Hong Kong. They don't mention the military threats against Taiwan. They don't mention the murders of Indian soldiers on the Indian border. They don't mention the religious, you can't have your own free religion in China. And so I think it's a really a skewed view that's being promoted by these China hands that have been captured by the Chinese Communist Party.
It is. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with more on the other side with Captain James Fanell, one of our country's foremost experts on the threat we're facing from the Chinese Communist Party, right after this.